Davos Seaworth stood on the high tower of Storm's End, gazing over the churning, slate-gray waters of Shipbreaker Bay. He felt a chill he had never quite grown used to, even after all these years at sea and in fortress keeps. The war, had it truly ended? Or had the realm merely fallen into another uneasy lull, full of shifting alliances, half-kept promises, and weary souls who spoke of peace but wore distrust like a second skin? Davos breathed in the salt air. Behind him, the thick walls of the ancient Baratheon seat provided a certain comfort, but old scars and older ghosts still lingered in his mind. He remembered Stannis Baratheon's faith in the Lord of Light, the flickering shadows of Melisandre's fires. He remembered the black cell in the Red Keep, the feel of shackles around his wrists, and the words, "Onion Knight," spat with contempt by lords and knights who did not understand the quiet strength of perseverance. He remembered the final battles of the wars that had torn the Seven Kingdoms apart, forging a fragile victory out of unimaginable loss. Now, in the aftermath, chaos reigned in the small corners of the realm. The Iron Throne might have been reseated. Some even said it had been melted into a different shape entirely. But for the common folk, peace was a word used too hastily, a promise unfulfilled. Davos had found himself at Storm's End by the will of those who believed he had a part to play. Word had spread that Davos Seaworth, once the loyal hand to King Stannis, once the liaison to Daenerys Targaryen, once the wise counselor to Jon Snow, was a man worth listening to. He had gained this reputation not through birthright or cunning, but through honest dealing and unshakable morality. Good men had died, great houses had crumbled, and countless families lay scattered across the land. Still, the Onion Knight stood upright, battered but unbroken, forced to accept a role he neither sought nor fully believed he deserved: peacemaker. He had returned to Storm's End at the behest of a council of lesser lords and ladies who were desperate for stability. Although the Baratheon line was all but extinguished, the fortress remained a symbol of power and legitimacy in the Stormlands, and Davos, by virtue of his past service, was one of the few individuals with enough influence to keep the peace. Letters had come from the Reach, from Dorne, from what remained of the Riverlands, all bearing the same plea: "We need you, Ser Davos. Help us broker something lasting. Help us heal." He closed his eyes and recalled the first time he had sailed into these waters as a smuggler with a boatload of onions, desperate to feed a starving garrison. Now, decades later, he was inside those walls by right of trust, not subterfuge. His heart still carried the same humility. He knew the realm needed more than one man's conscience. It needed unity, or at least a semblance of it. But Davos Seaworth had learned the cost of illusions. He would not promise more than he could deliver, and he would strive to deliver all that he had promised. He turned away from the battlements and made his way into the keep. The corridors were echoing, quiet with the hush of uncertain times. He passed by servants who bowed politely, a sign of respect that Davos returned with a short dip of the head. He had never felt entirely comfortable with such deference. In his mind, every man and woman was equal before the stranger, the mother, or whichever god one held dear. But the courtesy reminded him of the role he must now fulfill. He was no lord, no king, but he was a symbol of hope that the Seven Kingdoms could yet find an honest broker. Inside the war room, a long table of oak was spread with maps. Tallow candles stood in tall iron holders, sputtering light on the worn parchment that depicted the entire realm, from the frosty north to sun-scorched Dorne. Davos lingered at the table, eyes tracing the familiar outlines of castles and roads. He noted how the bold black ink lines of the map parted around the broken branch, how the thick swirl of forest in the Kingswood suggested wild hearts still beat there. Every inch of the map had been steeped in blood at one time or another. Sighing, he glanced up to see Maester Corbin, a thin man with hair the color of week-old snow. Corbin was the one assigned to Storm's End after the last maester had died from winter fever. His eyes held a certain wariness, as though he still found it astonishing that a former smuggler should hold such trust. But he seemed prepared to do his duty. "Ser Davos," Corbin said, stepping forward. "Another raven has arrived, this one from Lord Gunser Wild. Any good news?" Davos asked, though he suspected the answer. Corbin shook his head. He writes that bandits are harrying the roads near Rainhouse. He requests men. Someone to deal with these thieves before it grows worse. Davos sighed. The Stormlands were never a place for simple solutions. Where shall I find men? The lords look to you for guidance, Maester Corbin said carefully, as though delivering a subtle reprimand or perhaps an earnest observation. You may not have an army of your own, but the people believe in you. They might fight if you call them. Davos ran his hand over the thick stubble on his jaw. The winds of war had scattered armies and reduced many once proud houses to shells of their former selves. I'll need more than a few men, he muttered. These roads are the lifeblood of trade. If travelers can't pass safely, we starve. He thought of sending ravens to old allies. In the north, Jon Snow, if he yet lived in the far recesses beyond the wall, would not be able to spare much. The Vale was still licking its wounds and trying to keep the peace at the Eyrie. The Riverlands had their own troubles, and Dorne had no love for the Stormlands or the concept of meddling. Still, Davos was not entirely without friends. There might be Sellswords who'd prefer an honest wage over brigandage. Perhaps lords who had once served under Stannis might recall the Onion Knight's unwavering loyalty. He gave a short nod. Send word to those who might answer. We can't allow these bandits to run riot. Let them know I'll do what I can. And Maester, if any come to Storm's End seeking honest employment, see that they're greeted kindly. We'll need every able arm. Corbin bowed and departed. Alone among the maps, Davos felt the weight of what he was trying to do. The lords and ladies scattered across the land clamored for order, but there was no single figure to rally behind. The Targaryen claim had splintered. The Baratheons, if Robert's bastards could be believed, were a rumor on the wind. The Lannisters were a broken house, lingering in the west with diminishing fortunes. The Starks held the north, but the distance was so great that their concerns rarely reached the Stormlands. Someone had to be the bridge, if only to stop the realm from toppling into another ruinous war. Davos remembered the day he had lost 4 fingers. He remembered the searing pain of the knife, the gratitude he felt for Stannis's justice and mercy. It was the day he learned that every man, no matter how lowborn, could serve a higher purpose. Now, the realm had turned to him, the once lowborn smuggler, to be a figure of stability. He knew that peace was a precarious dream, but dreams, at least, gave people the strength to move forward, and in that forward motion, perhaps real hope could be found. Months passed in restless activity, though the heavy sense of anticipation never quite lifted. Letters came and went, flocks of ravens swooping in and out of Storm's End until the courtyard floor was speckled with droppings and feathers. Slowly, word trickled back. A handful of knights from the Crownlands would lend their steel. Some free riders from the Reach were looking for honest pay. A few hedge knights responded to the Onion Knight's call. By mid-autumn, Davos found himself with a motley group of fighters numbering nearly 300. Far from a great host, but more than the handful he'd commanded a season ago. He gathered them in the courtyard for the first time, standing on a raised wooden platform near the stables. They were as varied a band as he'd ever seen. Some wore patchwork armor, others had shining steel newly forged in lesser smithies. Their faces were set, hopeful or grim, but all eyes were fixed on Davos. He cleared his throat, unsure how a smuggler, a knight in name only, should address such a crowd. But he'd never been one for flowery speeches. Honesty would have to do. "My friends," he began, voice echoing off the stone walls. "I thank you for coming here. You know my name. I'm Davos Seaworth. I've been called the Onion Knight, been called traitor, been called Hand of the King. What I am now, I can't rightly say." He paused, letting the hush settle. "We've had too many wars. We've seen kings rise and fall. But when you ride out from Storm's End, remember this, the people along the road, the small folk, are the ones who've paid dearest. They've lost sons, daughters, crops, livelihoods. We've got bandits and roving Sellswords taking what isn't theirs because they think no one is watching. Well, we are watching. It'll be our task to make these roads safe again, to let the farmers tend their fields without fear. I can't promise you gold like a Lannister, he went on, or songs like a Tyrell or power like a Targaryen, but I can promise you this: what we do for the good of the realm. And if we succeed, we might show the lords and ladies that a peace is worth defending. The roads might be the beginning, but if we can secure them, we might secure more than just safe passage. We might secure hope. A ragged cheer went up. Davos nodded, stepping down. His fingers tingled. The stumps where Stannis's justice had been delivered ached in the chill air. He tried not to think of the cost of every war, every fealty. Instead, he looked into the faces of men and women who'd volunteered for a cause that might be bigger than themselves. They had chosen to unite under the battered sails of Storm's End, under the quiet leadership of a smuggler knight who had somehow outlived many a mightier figure. That afternoon, Davos walked among the men, speaking quietly with small pockets of them. He learned their names, their stories. He encountered a woman called Alice, clad in boiled leather. She said she'd lost 2 sisters to bandits near Duskendale and wanted to ensure no one else would share that fate. A tall, lanky youth named Tom Larch bore a sword too big for him, but his eyes shone with determination. He'd been a farmer's son who witnessed his father's fields burned by men who claimed to fight for a king he'd never heard of. Davos offered them both the same gentle encouragement. We need your courage. We need your will. By day's end, Davos's back ached, and his mind swirled with the enormity of the tasks ahead. Yet he felt a small spark of optimism in his chest. The realm might be wounded beyond measure, but in these men and women, he saw a willingness to heal the land in practical ways. That willingness, more than any royal decree, would be the building block of a lasting peace. Within a fortnight, the roads were being patrolled. In scattered engagements, Davos's ragtag band cornered thieving parties, ran off highwaymen, and secured merchant caravans that had once feared venturing outside safe walls. At the head of a small contingent, Davos rode out often, never letting himself be the sort of commander who ruled from a distant keep. He remembered how Stannis had led assaults himself, how men fought harder for a leader who shared their risks. The results were noticeable. In villages that had been half abandoned, folk began to tentatively return. Merchants coming from the Reach reported better trade, more stable prices. The lords who had lent Davos men began to speak well of him, praising his diligence. Meanwhile, those lords who had remained aloof watched with keen interest. A smuggler turned knight turning bandits into dust. Perhaps there was something to be gained by supporting him. Ravens arrived with offers of minor alliances. We can send a small squad, or we are willing to discuss possible trade deals. Davos tried not to let hope curdle into arrogance. He knew how quickly fortune could turn. The bandit problem might recede in the Stormlands, but there were still tensions in the Westerlands and the Crownlands. Lannisport was rumored to be dealing with uprisings from disillusioned peasants who no longer trusted their broken house. King's Landing, though nominally under a council's rule, was rife with corruption and old vendettas. And beyond it all, the North felt as distant as the moon. No one was entirely certain who governed the monarchy. Some whispered that the Targaryen queen had flown off on her dragon, never to return. Others murmured that the remnants of the great houses had formed a loose council. In truth, the leadership was so tenuous that no one could speak of a proper king or queen. Late one evening, after a long day of riding patrol, Davos and a handful of trusted companions, Alice, Tom Larch, and a veteran knight named Ser Branny's Fell, returned to Storm's End. They dismounted wearily in the courtyard, brushing the dust from their cloaks. As they walked inside, Maester Corbin hurried up with a sealed letter. "From King's Landing," Corbin said, a note of excitement in his voice. "It seems the council requests your presence, Ser Davos." Davos took the parchment and studied the wax seal, which bore a simple crown rather than the sigil of any great house. He broke it open and read, "Ser Davos Seaworth, it has come to the attention of the Council of the Seven Kingdoms that your efforts in the Stormlands have brought stability to an area long plagued by outlaws and strife. The Council invites you to King's Landing, where discussions regarding a more unified approach to governance and peacekeeping are to be held. Your presence is humbly requested, as your counsel and moral standing are widely admired." It was signed simply, Lord Regent Tyreek Lannister, on behalf of the council. Davos felt a pang of old caution. The Lannisters had never been friends of his, though he had once been hand alongside Tyrion Lannister during a brief and tumultuous alliance. Tyreek, if Davos recalled correctly, was a cousin to Tyrion, a lesser-known figure, rumored to have survived the chaos in King's Landing by lying low. But times had changed, and if Tyreek had managed to climb to a position of Lord Regent, it indicated at least some measure of cunning or political support. "So," Alice asked, her voice tired yet tinged with curiosity, "will you go?" "I suppose I must," Davos said, folding the parchment. "I've never been one to relish the intrigues of King's Landing. But if the realm is to have any peace, we must not ignore them." Ser Branny's Fell ran a hand through his short beard. "I'll gather an escort, Ser. You won't travel alone. These roads might be safer, but the path to King's Landing is never truly free from danger." Davos nodded. He gazed out the keep window, at the darkness creeping across the courtyard, enveloping men and stone alike. The silhouette of Storm's End's towering walls felt like a protective cloak. "We'll leave in a few days," he decided. "Let's hope the council truly wants peace." In the recesses of his mind, however, he felt a twinge. The memory of politics in King's Landing was a labyrinth of betrayal, hidden agendas, and half-truths. It had devoured many good men. He reminded himself that he was no cunning viper, no born manipulator. His only armor was honesty. Whether that armor would withstand the capital's poison remained to be seen. The journey to King's Landing took them through winding roads that skirted the Rose Road and the King's Wood. For the first time in months, Davos traveled beyond the domain of the Stormlands. His escort was modest but dedicated. Ser Branny's Fell took the lead, along with Tom Larch and a dozen others, including Alice, who had refused to remain behind. "If you're to talk peace, you need to show the council you've got a cross-section of the realm at your back," she reasoned. "Not just an old knight." Davos gave a small laugh. "Mind your tongue. I'm an old knight myself." She grinned, adjusting the sword belt on her hip. "But you're the old knight with half the realm's hopes pinned on you, so you need me there to watch your back." They slept in inns along the way, but as they drew closer to King's Landing, they saw the scars of war more plainly. Burned-out hovels, charred fields that had never been replanted, refugees begging by the roadside. Davos tried not to let his heart sink at the sight, but it was a grim reminder of how far from peace the realm truly remained. On the final stretch of road, they passed through the main gate of King's Landing, behind a lumbering wagon of root vegetables. The city had changed since Davos's last visit. The outer walls bore new fortifications, a result of some hasty rebuilding. Where once the city had teemed with people jammed together in chaos, now it seemed half-empty. Whole neighborhoods had been abandoned or destroyed in the final siege. Rubbish and debris still littered the corners, though attempts at cleanup were evident. Soldiers wearing no single unified crest walked the streets. Some wore the Lion of Lannister, others the sigil of different houses, indicating an uneasy patchwork garrison. As Davos and his companions rode through Flea Bottom, the stench of rot and sewage made him grimace. He recalled the nights he had sneaked in here as a smuggler, braving the labyrinthine alleys. Now, the eyes that peered from shadows were hollow with desperation. He wondered how many recognized him, if any. Likely they had bigger concerns, such as where their next meal might come from. The Red Keep towered over the city as ever, though its silhouette bore the marks of partial collapse in places. When they finally reached the gate, a group of guards escorted them inside. They dismounted in the courtyard, and Davos felt a tightness in his chest. Memories of the last time he walked these halls flooded back. How he had pled with Daenerys for mercy, how he had been locked in a cell by Queen Cersei's men, how he had tried to broker alliances with Tyrion Lannister. Now he returned, older still, with the realm on a razor's edge. A page in simple clothes approached. "Ser Davos Seaworth, welcome. My Lord Regent awaits in the throne room." Davos removed his gloves and nodded to his companions. "See that their horses are stabled and find them suitable rooms if you can," he told the page. Then to his escort, "Wait for me. I'll see what the regent wants, and then we can decide how to proceed. He followed the page through the Red Keep's corridors. The opulence he remembered was tarnished by war's aftermath. Half-repaired windows, scorched tapestries, the hush of a place uncertain of its future. Yet certain remnants of grandeur remained. The columns soared overhead, and the floor was polished marble, albeit cracked in places. As they entered the throne room, Davos glanced at the Iron Throne, or what remained of it. Some said it had been melted by dragonfire. Now it appeared as a seat built from leftover metal, a crude echo of its former spiky glory. Standing beside it was a man with golden hair receding from his temples, wearing a circlet of plain gold. Tyreek Lannister, Lord Regent. Tyreek's eyes widened in polite welcome. "Ser Davos Seaworth," he said, stepping forward with a measured smile. "You do the city a great honor with your presence. I've heard much of your efforts in the Stormlands." Davos inclined his head. "Thank you, my lord. I come at your invitation, hoping we might find ways to bring out a stronger peace." Tyreek gestured for Davos to approach. No courtiers sat on the dais, and the throne room felt uncomfortably large for so few. On the steps leading to the Iron Throne perched a handful of other council members, minor lords or advisors. They eyed Davos with a mixture of curiosity and caution. "We are in need of men like you, Ser Davos," Tyreek began in a friendly tone. "The Stormlands were all but lawless until you stepped in. Now I hear trade routes are safe, and bandits flee at the mere mention of your name." "I'm just a man trying to do right, my lord," Davos replied. Tyreek's smile held a trace of condescension. "Modest as ever, but let us speak plainly. The realm is in disarray. Without a strong hand on the throne, or at least guiding the throne, we risk further fracturing. The council has wrestled with many ideas. A regency, a new monarchy, perhaps a smaller kingsmoot of sorts to choose leadership. But we cannot simply decree a new king and expect all to bend the knee." Davos nodded in agreement. He knew firsthand how the great houses might bristle at any attempt to be commanded. The Targaryen attempt to reclaim the throne had sparked a war of unstoppable violence. The memory of dragonfire scorching half the city still lingered in the corners of these halls. Tyreek went on, "You, Ser Davos, have earned the respect of many lords who despise the name Lannister. They see in you a man of honesty and principle, a man who stood by his king, Stannis, until he could stand no more, and then sought an alliance with Daenerys Targaryen with the aim of saving the realm. All the while, you never indulged in cruelty or duplicity. That is a rare reputation indeed. I'm honored by your words. I only hope I can live up to them." Tyreek's gaze drifted around the throne room. "We wish to form a new assembly of sorts, a gathering of respected voices from each region, to lay down the framework of laws and cooperation. We'd like you to lead it, Ser Davos." Davos felt a rush of surprise. "Lead it?" Tyreek spread his hands. "In a sense, yes. You would act as moderator, or perhaps the realm's mediator. Each lord or representative would gather under your auspices. Together, we draft agreements about trade, law enforcement, taxes, enough to keep the peace. And if we succeed, we might avoid further war. Will you consider it?" A hush fell over the room as Tyreek's words echoed. Davos could feel the eyes of the council members on him, some hopeful, others wary. He recalled the days when he was but a smuggler, never dreaming that lords and ladies would one day look to him for leadership. Yet he also knew the Seven Kingdoms needed more than empty words. If there was a chance to weave together the scraps of a battered realm, he owed it to the people to try. "I will consider it, my Lord Regent," Davos said slowly. "But I'm no lord, and I have no illusions about how difficult such a task will be. I'll want certain guarantees, like ensuring we don't just crown another tyrant." He paused. "And I'll want to know that the small folk won't be ignored when these new laws are forged." Tyreek nodded as though relieved. "Then let's speak more in council chambers. You must be weary from your journey. The Red Keep will host you and your company. I'll see to it your chambers are made comfortable." Davos bowed and allowed the page to lead him away. As he walked back along the corridor, his footsteps echoing in the dim light, He felt the weight of a realm pressing on his shoulders. He whispered to himself, "This is madness." But in the flicker of torchlight, the memory of all he had lost, from his sons to the illusions of glory, reminded him that any madness might be worth risking if it could spare the realm from another war. That night, Davos supped with his closest companions in a small chamber assigned to him. The Red Keep was large enough that many halls had been closed off, a testament to the city's reduced population. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting shadows across the faces around the table. Alice, Tom Larch, and Ser Brannies ate simple fare: barley stew, crusty bread, a bit of dried fruit, and watered wine. Davos explained Tyreek's proposal. Alice nearly choked on her stew. "They want you to lead a council of lords? You? I mean, no offense, Ser, but..." "None taken," Davos said. "I'm as surprised as you." Tom Larch, who was younger and had the naive wonder of youth, smiled. "That's brilliant. You've done so much in the Stormlands. Imagine what you could do for the entire realm." Ser Brannies' mouth was set in a tight line. "This is a lion's den. If it isn't Tyreek Lannister's trap, it could be someone else's. The moment you try to broker something that goes against certain lords' interests, they may turn on you." Davos listened to them carefully, stirring his stew. "We can't let fear guide us, but we'd be fools to ignore it. The realm needs some structure, that much is clear. If we let every lord do as he pleases, we'll be at each other's throats within a year. But yes, it's dangerous to assume Tyreek Lannister's invitation is entirely benevolent. We must walk carefully." They ate in reflective silence for a while. Then Alice spoke up, her voice quieter. "Ser Davos, you've seen more than any of us. But do you think a council can really hold the Seven Kingdoms together? Didn't we try something like that before?" Davos exhaled. "We've seen councils fail, kings fail, coalitions fail. But you know what else has failed? War, division, ignoring the small folk. Everything we've tried has led to bloodshed. Maybe this is just another gamble, but I'll not sit idle while the realm tears itself apart again." He set his spoon down, feeling the fatigue of the day and the heaviness of the choice that lay before him. "We'll meet them in good faith. We'll try. It's all we can do." They nodded, and each in their own way, they accepted the resolution in Davos's words. When the meal concluded, they retired to their respective rooms, leaving Davos alone by the dying hearth. He stared at the embers, recalling the faces of those who had once championed peace. Shireen Baratheon, whose innocence had been snuffed out by madness. Jon Snow, who had borne the weight of a kingdom's survival on his shoulders. Even the silver-haired Daenerys, who had dreamed of breaking the wheel but got ensnared in its turning. "Let me be wiser," he whispered to the darkness. "Let me do better." Over the next weeks, delegates arrived in King's Landing, lured by rumors of a new assembly that might define the realm's future. They came from every corner of Westeros. A few minor lords from the north, uncertain of who truly reigned there now that the Starks were so distant. A delegation from the Vale, led by a sharp-eyed knight who claimed to represent Lord Robert Arryn's interests. A cadre of reach lords, some barely more than ambitious landholders seeking power in the vacuum left by the Tyrells' downfall. Even a small but notable party from Dorne, swathed in cloaks of desert hues, glowering at every corner as though the capital were an enemy fortress. Tyreek Lannister presided over them as Lord Regent, but the real focus of the assembly turned out to be Davos Seaworth. At Tyreek's urging, they gathered in a once grand hall that had been partially repaired, a place with a long wooden table that could seat 20. Only the highest representatives were seated. Their retinues waited outside or in nearby chambers. Davos stood at the head of the table, not sitting in the seat of honor, but rather remaining upright as a sign of humility and because he found it easier to address them from that stance. "My lords and ladies," Davos began, "I am no orator. I'm not highborn, and I have no illusions about my place. But I stand before you because I've seen what war does to the realm. I've seen how mistrust, ambition, and vengeance tear us apart, and I've seen enough death to last 1,000 lifetimes. So if there is a path to peace, I want to walk it. I ask you all to walk it with me." He paused, letting the quiet settle. A dozen uncertain faces watched him. Some looked bored, others intrigued, and a few wore expressions that suggested they believed themselves to be the rightful rulers of this assembly. One of them, a tall lord from the Reach, cleared his throat. "And how do you propose we achieve peace, Ser Davos, when each region has its own needs? We have bandits, we have taxes, we have hungry mouths to feed." Davos nodded. "Indeed, that's why we're here, to discuss each region's needs and figure out how we can help each other. We can't solve it all at once, but we can make agreements. For instance, the Stormlands are opening trade routes again. The Reach has abundant harvests, if I'm not mistaken. Perhaps a fair deal can be struck to exchange needed goods. If roads are safe, that benefits you, your goods reach markets. And the Stormlands benefit by not starving." A woman from Dorne, Lady Delza, spoke in a measured tone. "Why should Dorne engage in these dealings? We can feed ourselves, and we have a long-standing tradition of independence. We bent the knee to Targaryens once, but that era is gone. Why bind ourselves again?" Murmurs spread around the table, some in agreement, others uneasy. Davos studied her, measuring his words carefully. "Because, my lady, the realm is not just a set of lines on a map, but a network of lives. If bandits prowl the Stormlands, how long before they slip into your borders? If trade falters in the Crownlands, how long before your own merchants lose vital markets? Dorne is strong, but can it stand alone if chaos engulfs the rest of Westeros? Peace benefits all, not just those who are starving now." She regarded him with cool eyes, then offered a small incline of her head. Davos had not convinced her entirely, but he had made her think. A low-born knight from the Riverlands, the remains of House Tully's allies, spoke up next. "My lands are scarred by marauders. Our small folk are too afraid to plant. If this assembly can provide a means to protect them and let us regrow, I'd give it my support." Davos exhaled, relief creeping in. He could sense that the conversation was shifting from skepticism to guarded optimism. Even so, forging actual treaties would be a test of patience. Tyreek Lannister observed from the side, occasionally interjecting to reinforce Davos's points, but mostly letting Davos lead. Gradually, over the course of days, the delegates hammered out preliminary agreements. Safe trade routes, shared responsibility for clearing bandits, a modest tax to fund a new city watch that would patrol not only King's Landing but also key roads in the Crownlands and Stormlands. Discussions about a central leadership were postponed, as none could agree on who should sit on the Iron Throne, if the Iron Throne was even the seat they wanted to restore. In these sessions, Davos found himself constantly balancing alliances, warding off old grudges. He also discovered that some delegates sought to use this assembly to gain advantage. A cunning lord from the Westerlands implied that his support hinged on receiving shipments of grain from the Reach at below-market prices. A Vale Knight quietly threatened to withdraw his men from the roads unless he received recognition of certain disputed borderlands. Through it all, Davos's pragmatic morality became his anchor. He refused to let the assembly devolve into extortion or petty power grabs. He favored no faction, demanded fair negotiations, and insisted on abiding by a sense of the greater good. Some bristled at his intransigence, but others respected it. "If you cross Ser Davos with false promises," one Dornish retainer was heard saying in the courtyard, "you'd best watch yourself. He may not have an army, but he's got the moral backbone to call your bluff. And the rest will follow him if he does." That was the quiet power Davos had discovered. In a realm sick of lies and betrayals, a consistent, honest broker could wield more influence than a cunning warlord. Perhaps it wouldn't last forever. Eventually, someone might try to buy him or remove him. But for now, at least, Davos managed to keep the assembly on track, working steadily towards something resembling order. The nights were the hardest for Davos. While the days were full of negotiations, the nights left him alone with his thoughts. In his room at the Red Keep, he would lie awake, listening to the distant hum of the city, the occasional cry in the streets, the echo of passing guards. In those quiet hours, he'd recall the laughter of Shireen Baratheon, the stern kindness of Stannis, the resolute bravery of Jon Snow. He wondered if they would approve of what he was doing. He wondered if it would all collapse like so many good intentions before. As the assembly's efforts took shape, rumors swirled that some major houses resented Davos's central role. The Ironborn, for instance, were suspiciously absent. Some said they were regrouping under a new leader who wanted to reassert independence through raids. Others whispered that House Greyjoy was in no condition to launch raids, but was simply biding its time. The North, too, remained distant. None of the major Stark bannermen had shown up, and no word had come from Winterfell. One evening, Davos received a raven from the north. Maester Corbin delivered it to him personally. As Davos opened the parchment, his eyes flickered over the words. A short note from a steward at Winterfell who expressed that the North was dealing with harsh conditions and could spare neither men nor attention for the assembly in King's Landing. Davos read between the lines. They wanted no part in the capital's intrigues. Not for now. They might watch from afar, but they were not ready to trust another southern venture, given the betrayals the Starks had faced. Davos respected their stance. He dispatched a courteous reply, saying the door remained open whenever the North was ready. Then he set the matter aside. The North might come around eventually, or it might remain aloof, but he couldn't force them. He had more immediate concerns, like ensuring the assembly didn't descend into infighting. The more progress the assembly made, the louder the rumblings of discontent became from certain corners. A minor scion of House Lannister muttered darkly that Davos was trying to replace the monarchy with commoner rule. A Martell retainer joked that the Onion Knight was peeling back layers of power that once belonged to trueborn nobility. Davos heard these words and endured them. He didn't want to replace anything with personal power. He only wanted a realm free from the next wave of slaughter. It was perhaps inevitable that there would be a crisis. It came in the form of a dispute between the Vale and the Riverlands over a series of border villages. The Vale's representative insisted the villages historically belonged to them, while the Riverlands knight claimed that for centuries they had been Tully bannermen. It seemed a minor squabble from afar, but for the two lords in question, it was a matter of pride and resources. They met in the assembly hall, voices rising. Davos tried to moderate, but tensions flared. The Vale Knight accused the Riverlander of forging documents. The Riverlander spat. "You have no right to question my honor." They nearly came to blows. Tyreek Lannister watched with growing concern. Davos raised a hand. "Enough. We have bigger matters than these villages. We're trying to avoid war, not start a new one over a boundary line." The Vale Knight glared at him. "How dare you minimize this? My Lord Father bled for those villages against mountain clans. They belong to us." Davos's lips pressed into a thin line. "Good men have bled for every scrap of land in Westeros. That doesn't mean we keep drawing lines in blood." He took a breath, steadying himself. "We will form a committee, a small group of neutral lords, to examine any evidence you both provide. Then they will make a recommendation based on fairness. If you want me to lead that committee, I will, but I'd rather it be lords of your mutual choosing." The knight from the Vale still looked ready to explode, but the other delegates, more weary of conflict, supported Davos's proposal. They had come too far to let the entire assembly be derailed by a local feud. Reluctantly, both sides agreed to abide by the committee's findings, though each threatened to withdraw if the verdict went against them. Davos sensed that was the best compromise possible. He tried to mask his own frustration. If they would not yield on small matters, how would they stand together on more vital issues? The day ended in anxious stalemate, and Davos found himself at Tyreek Lannister's private solar, drinking watered wine and feeling his head pound. Tyreek studied him with an appraising look. "You handled that about as well as anyone could, but you see how precarious this is. One spark can set them off." Davos nodded, rubbing his brow. "Aye, but we have to keep at it. If we let them walk away, it'll be bloodshed on the roads again." Tyreek swirled his cup. "You've done much good here, Ser Davos. The roads around King's Landing are safer, trade is picking up, and the lords are at least talking. You could claim a formal position, be the realm's hand or its lord protector. Have you considered it?" Davos gave him a sharp look. "I'm no tyrant, my lord. Titles aren't what I seek. It needn't be tyranny, Tyreek said in a conciliatory tone. You'd be recognized as the realm's steward until we form a permanent leadership. The lords might accept that. They already look to you for guidance. Davos thought of the seductive lure of power, the chance to do more good, to shape the realm's destiny. Yet he also recalled how power had corrupted or destroyed so many. He had told Stannis once, "I am the king's loyal man." But Stannis's unyielding quest for the throne had led to darkness and tragedy. Power carried a terrible price. "I'll not take a crown or a seat on the Iron Throne," Davos said quietly. "If the Assembly wants me to guide them as a mediator, I'll do that. But I serve the realm, not rule it. It's important we find a system that outlives any single man." Tyreek studied him for a long moment. Then he sighed. "Your humility astounds me, Ser Davos. Very well. Let's continue as we are." They parted ways, but Davos remained troubled. Could the realm truly forge a stable leadership without a single monarch at its head? Or would they drift into chaos again once the memory of war had faded? He could not see the future. All he could do was hold onto his integrity and hope that it guided him rightly. Slowly, the Assembly's efforts bore fruit. Trade routes were officially reopened in several regions, with tolls and taxes set at reasonable rates. A combined force of men from the Crownlands, Stormlands, and even a few knights from the Reach began patrolling main roads, reducing the threat of banditry. Encouraged by these steps, some lords who had stood apart came forward to sign the King's Landing Concord, a provisional agreement to keep the peace and support mutual prosperity. The Vale Riverlands border dispute continued to be an irritant, but Davos's committee worked tirelessly, sifting through dusty records and hearing testimony. While the final decision was yet to be made, the threat of outright violence receded. Meanwhile, ravens flew north, west, and south, bearing the news that the Crownlands might be safe again for trade, that a new era of cooperation could be dawning. Many were skeptical, but some believed enough to test the roads themselves. A turning point came when a caravan of goods from Sunspear arrived in King's Landing unmolested. The Dornish envoy declared this a triumph and promptly invited the other delegates to sample the fine wines and spices they had brought. The gloom that had hovered over the assembly lifted a bit that evening, as the hall echoed with clinking cups and guarded smiles. Davos allowed himself a small moment of hope, sipping the strong Dornish wine. When he looked around the room, he saw men and women who had been raised to view each other as enemies, now sharing a meal. Even Tyreek Lannister and a Dornish noble who had once fought against the Lannisters made careful toasts to one another. It might be fragile, it might be fleeting, but it was something. He felt a tap on his shoulder and turned to see Alice in a simple green dress, looking more at ease than she did in her boiled leather. "You've done it?" she whispered, leaning in close enough to be heard over the din. "I can't believe the realm's lords are in one room without trying to kill each other." Davos gave a wry smile. "It's a step forward, but there are more steps ahead than behind." She looked at him, her eyes shining in the torchlight. "Still, it's something. The small folk are already talking. There's real hope out there. They're saying the Onion Knight might do what all the kings failed to do." "Let's not put too much faith in rumors," Davos said gently. "But if they believe, maybe that belief can help keep the peace." She nodded, raising her cup to him. "To hope, then." "To hope?" Davos echoed, clinking cups. In that moment, he allowed himself a rare feeling of satisfaction. They might still fail. The realm's old wounds might open, and new ones might form. But tonight, in King's Landing, a seed of collaboration had sprouted. Perhaps that seed, watered by the shared grief and exhaustion of war, could grow into something resembling unity. Word of the Assembly's success spread. Smaller houses from the Westerlands arrived, hoping to negotiate their own trade deals. A group from the Reach, led by an ambitious lady named Mara Flowers, rumored to be a bastard cousin of the extinct Tyrell line, offered a proposal for a grand harvest festival that could unite the regions in a celebration of bounty. The idea intrigued many delegates, who saw it as a way to build goodwill. Davos listened patiently to every proposal, trying to gauge what would truly benefit the realm. He'd have happily let someone else take the reins, but everyone looked to him for final judgment or mediation. It was exhausting, but as Alice pointed out, his presence reassured them. If another civil war was to be avoided, they needed a moral center. Somehow, that center had become Davos Seaworth. On a crisp morning, as Davos was reviewing updates with Maester Corbin, Ser Branny's fell burst into the chamber. "Ser Davos," he said, breathless. "Riders from the Stormlands have arrived. There's trouble along the southern coast. Another raid, ships bearing the Kraken sigil." Davos's heart sank. "The Ironborn. Where?" "Near Estermont lands," Branny's confirmed. "They've seized fishermen, burned a few villages, looted what they could. Then they fled, but the rumor is they'll return soon." Davos cursed under his breath. If the Ironborn had decided to test the realm's strength, this could be the start of a new wave of chaos. The Assembly had done much to secure roads, but not the coasts. "We need to respond," he said firmly. "We can't let them think we're defenseless at sea." Branny's nodded. "Agreed. Shall I gather a company and march south?" Davos thought of his smuggler's past. He knew the power of ships and how devastating Ironborn raids could be if left unchecked. "Marching might not be enough. We need ships in the water. The Ironborn could strike anywhere along the coast if they sense weakness." He realized this was a moment that would test the Assembly's resolve. Would the Lords band together to defend the Stormlands? Or would they say, "That's your problem, Onion Knight?" Davos decided to force their hand. By midday, he called an emergency session of the Assembly. The hall filled with delegates, some anxious, others bored. Tyreek Lannister took his place at the side, deferring to Davos. "My lords and ladies," Davos announced, "we've received word of Ironborn raids in the Stormlands. Villages burned, families taken as thralls. If we fail to act, the Ironborn will only grow bolder. We must defend our coasts. This is not just a Stormlands issue. If the Ironborn gain a foothold, they'll be raiding the Reach, the Crownlands, even the Westerlands." Some murmured agreement, but others fidgeted. Lady Delza of Dorne spoke up. "We have no interest in sending Dornish ships to protect another region's coast. Our own shores require safeguarding." A lord from the Reach sniffed. "The Stormlands are your domain, Ser Davos. Surely you can muster enough ships." Davos kept his temper in check. "We have some ships, but not enough to contain a full-scale Ironborn incursion. Remember, the old wars are over. If we stand as one realm, we must protect each other. Or do we let old divisions feed new marauders?" Tyreek Lannister supported him. "The Ironborn have a habit of exploiting weakness. If we do not unite, they'll pick us off piecemeal. My Lord Father lost much of the Lannister fleet in the last war. We have only a handful of ships left, but they can join with Ser Davos's. Will others do the same?" A hush fell. Then the Riverlands Knight stepped forward. "We have no fleet, but I can spare ground troops to reinforce the coastal garrisons. That way, Stormlands ships can focus on patrolling the sea rather than defending the land." This sparked a discussion. After some wrangling, the Vale's delegate pledged a small token force, and the Reach Lords agreed to lend a few ships. Even Dorne acquiesced to send a pair of fast raiding vessels. It wasn't a grand fleet, but it was a collective effort. Davos sensed this was a turning point. Either they would stand by these pledges, or the Assembly's unity would fracture. He arranged to travel south to direct the effort personally, leaving Tyreek in charge of the Assembly. A few delegates offered to accompany him. Most, however, chose to remain in King's Landing to watch how events unfolded. Davos told them all the same thing: "Pray that we succeed. If we fail, you'll be next." The southern coast of the Stormlands was battered by wind and salt, an endless stretch of cliffs and rocky shores. Davos arrived aboard the Seafoam, a small but sturdy warship. The promised forces trickled in: a Lannister galley, a pair of swift Dornish corsairs, and 3 modest ships from the Reach. On land, a contingent of Riverlands Knights joined Stormlands men under Ser Branny's Fell's command. They established a rough camp near Estermont lands, a strategic location to respond to further raids. By day, Davos conferred with the captains, scouting possible Ironborn landing sites. By night, he paced near the flickering campfires, wondering if the Ironborn would strike or slip away into the darkness. The days stretched into a week. Then came the dawn watch when the horns sounded. Sails on the horizon, longships moving swiftly toward the coast. Cries echoed through the camp. The men rushed to their stations, archers scrambling, ships cutting through the waves to intercept. Davos stood on the Seafoam's deck, stumps of his fingers throbbing as he clutched the railing. He shouted orders to the men at the oars, reminding himself that though he was once a smuggler, now he commanded a patchwork fleet. Ironborn reavers closed in. Their sails bore the sigil of the Kraken, black on gray. They moved with the skill of generations of sea raiders. The Dornish corsairs sped to meet them, launching arrows from deck-mounted crossbows. The Lannister galley came around, its crew hurling spears. For a tense, bloody half-hour, the sea battle raged. Ironborn warriors leaped onto allied ships, hacking with axes. The smell of salt and blood mingled in the air. Davos had never been a great warrior, but he stood on deck with sword in hand, driving back an Ironborn who tried to board the Seafoam. The Reaver swung a cruel axe that Davos barely deflected, the shock making his arm numb. Another blow came, scraping across Davos's mail. Gritting his teeth, Davos lunged forward, hooking the man's leg with a quick twist. Off balance, the raider stumbled, and a Stormlands archer put an arrow through his throat. Across the churning waters, Davos saw a Dornish ship set ablaze. But the Ironborn had suffered losses, too. Several of their longships drifted, crewless or burning. The chaos of battle eventually resolved, the Ironborn realizing they faced organized resistance. They began to retreat. The Allied ships pursued, but Davos signaled for caution. "Don't chase them too far," he yelled, knowing the Ironborn might lead them into a trap. By midday, the Ironborn were gone, leaving wreckage and wounded behind. The Allied fleet limped back to shore. Davos oversaw the recovery, cringing at the sight of sailors with missing limbs, knights who had drowned in their armor. But they had repelled the raid. The cost was high, but the Ironborn had been driven back, showing them that the coast was not undefended. Once the immediate crisis was contained, Davos sent ravens to King's Landing to report that the Allied response had been successful. "The Ironborn have been repulsed," he wrote. "Casualties on our side, but they have retreated. This victory belongs to all who came together. Stormlands, Westerlands, Dorne, the Reach, and the Riverlands. Let it be a sign of what unity can achieve." When the news reached King's Landing, it reportedly buoyed the spirits of the assembly. If lords once skeptical of the alliance saw that combined arms had thwarted a common foe, they might be more open to compromise. For Davos, the battle felt like a grim reminder of the realm's fragility. Peace was not simply a parchment to be signed, it had to be defended with sweat and blood. But he also felt a flicker of pride. The newly minted unity had passed its first trial. They had stood together, at least in part, against an external threat. That was how the Seven Kingdoms might stay whole, standing side by side, rather than huddled behind old borders. Davos returned to King's Landing weeks later, his body sore and his heart heavy from the memories of the battle. The assembly greeted him with a subdued applause when he entered the council hall, showing more genuine respect than he'd expected. Tyreek Lannister approached him with an uncharacteristically warm handshake. "Well done, Ser Davos," the regent said. "You've shown that our alliances aren't just words. The lords have been more willing to finalize agreements now. We're even drafting a system of shared levies to maintain a standing force for the realm." "That's good to hear," Davos said, exhaustion evident in his voice. Tyreek motioned for him to sit, and Davos, for once, accepted gladly. The other delegates crowded around, each asking for details of the battle, how many ships were lost, how many men had died. Through it all, Davos remained measured. He told them the truth, that the fight had been harsh, that men on both sides had been butchered, but that the alliance had held firm. He ended with a warning: "Don't think the Ironborn are finished. This was a skirmish. We must remain vigilant." As the assembly resumed discussions, Davos realized how much had changed. The tension that once suffused the room was now tempered by shared purpose. He saw the Vale and the Riverlands delegates speaking calmly, apparently nearing a resolution over their border villages. He saw the Dornish and Reach delegates discussing trade routes with only mild sniping. The King's Landing Concord had become a living document, updated with new commitments. The seeds planted by Davos's moral determination were finally beginning to take root. That night, he stood on a balcony overlooking the city. The Red Keep's shadow fell across the rooftops, but here and there, he saw signs of life. Candles glowing in windows, the distant bustle of a late market. He heard a soft step behind him and turned to see Alice. She leaned on the balcony railing, gazing at the same lights. "You look tired, Ser Davos," she said softly. "I am," he admitted, "but there's work yet to be done." She smiled gently. "We all are, but we might just make it through. Look what you've done." Even Tyreek Lannister's changed his tune. "Word is, the Assembly wants to name you something akin to Protector of the Realm." Davos grimaced. "I don't need such titles. I only want them to keep working together after I'm gone." She reached out and touched his shoulder. "And maybe they will, but for now they need you as the anchor. Don't underestimate what a single honest man can do." Davos smiled ruefully, looking at the stumps of his fingers. "I never asked for this, but the realm asked it of me. I suppose that's enough." He turned back to the lights of the city. "Sometimes, I wonder if this is what Shireen would have wanted. She believed in fairy tales in a better world. Maybe this is as close as we'll get." Alice said nothing, merely stood beside him, sharing the moment of quiet reflection. Below them, King's Landing seemed almost at peace, a city beginning to heal from the wounds of war. Perhaps the rest of Westeros could follow. In the weeks that followed, the Assembly cemented more agreements. The Great Lords, or what was left of them, approved a measure to keep trade flowing under standardized tolls. They ratified a levy system to raise a small, unified force that would answer to the Assembly rather than a single king. They agreed to send envoys to the North and the Iron Islands, inviting them to participate in further negotiations, though no one truly expected the Ironborn to comply. Regardless, the gesture of openness was important. One crisp morning, Davos found himself again in the throne room. This time, the hall was fuller, with nearly all delegates present. Tyreek Lannister stood near the molten remains of the Iron Throne, motioning for quiet. When the chatter subsided, he addressed the crowd. "My lords, ladies, and honorable knights, the time has come to recognize the efforts that have brought us this far. We stand on the threshold of a new era in Westeros, one not governed by the iron fist of a single dynasty but by cooperation among its regions. Before us is the man who has guided us here, through honest counsel and tireless devotion. He has asked for no titles, no lands, no crown. But we, as an assembly, must acknowledge his service." Tyreek beckoned Davos forward. The hush in the throne room felt immense. Davos approached, self-conscious, aware of dozens of eyes upon him. He was just a smuggler from Flea Bottom, a father who had lost sons to war, a knight who had knelt before Stannis Baratheon. And now he stood in a position once reserved for kings and queens. Tyreek took a small steel circlet from a velvet cushion, far simpler than any crown. "In recognition of your efforts to unite the realm, we name you Lord Counselor of the Seven Kingdoms, a title that carries the authority to call this assembly, mediate disputes, and represent Westeros to any foreign power. Will you accept this, Ser Davos?" Davos glanced at the faces around him. Some nodded in encouragement, others watched him passively, but none openly objected. He swallowed, his throat dry. "If this is what the realm needs," he said quietly, "then I'll accept it on one condition, that our guiding principle remains the welfare of the common folk. This assembly must always remember that its power rests on the consent of those who toil in fields and shops, who fish and trade. If we betray them, we betray everything we've fought for." A smattering of applause arose, subdued but sincere. Tyreek inclined his head and placed the steel circlet gently on Davos's brow. It was light, but it felt heavier than any anchor chain Davos had borne at sea. He turned to face the assembly. They offered respect, if not kneeling in unison. No one bent the knee. This was not a kingship. It was something different, something new. Davos looked across the throne room, remembering all the times he had stood there a mere supplicant. He inhaled, letting the gravity of the moment settle. Perhaps he had indeed helped usher in a future of lasting peace. Or perhaps this was just the calm before another storm. Either way, he resolved to do his duty. Over the following year, Davos worked tirelessly with the assembly. They drafted a rudimentary constitution of sorts, a set of charters that delineated the responsibilities of each region, established how disputes would be resolved, and specified the powers of the Lord Counselor. The monarchy, in its old sense, was effectively put on indefinite hold. Some wondered if a Targaryen heir might yet appear, or if another house would claim the throne. But for now, no single ruler occupied the Iron Throne. Instead, a council of regional delegates governed under Davos's mediation. The roads remained safe, and the economy slowly recovered. Farms once burned were replanted. Merchants began to rebuild trade networks. The City Watch, financed by multiple lords, enforced a semblance of order in King's Landing. Local feuds still flared now and then, but they were largely contained by swift arbitration. The name Davos Seaworth became associated with fairness, a word that traveled across taverns and market squares, from Old Town to Gull Town. Of course, dissent still simmered. Some houses yearned for the day they could proclaim their own king. Others balked at paying taxes to fund a realm-wide system. The Ironborn raided occasionally, though less successfully when faced with a united navy. The North remained distant, though a few northern bannermen finally visited King's Landing to observe the changes, returning home with reports that the city was not the same viper's nest it had been. Amid this slow progress, Davos found time to breathe, to reflect. He spent occasional nights at Storm's End, checking on the men who first rallied to him, ensuring the Stormlands remained secure. Sometimes he visited the orphanages in King's Landing, remembering the battered children of war. He saw to it that bread prices stayed manageable, quietly subsidizing them with funds from the Assembly's treasury. He negotiated trade pacts with Essos traders who began to dock at the capital's harbor, drawn by the promise of stability. All the while, he insisted that the Assembly, not just himself, make major decisions. "I won't be a king," he told them over and over. "Kings lie rotting in the ground or on burnt thrones. We must rule together or not at all." As the seasons turned, rumors of new threats emerged. A potential rebellion in the Westerlands, whispers of a would-be Targaryen pretender across the narrow sea. Yet none gained enough traction to tear apart the fragile unity. Whenever issues arose, Davos convened the Assembly, hammered out compromises, and reminded them of the horrors they'd survived. "Let's not make the same mistakes again," he would say. "Let's not feed war's furnace with the bones of our children." And so Westeros, under the stewardship of the once smuggler, inched toward a lasting peace. It was not a glorious peace, nor was it built on grand pageants or triumphant conquests. It was a pragmatic peace, forged day by day through negotiation, honesty, and shared need. The small folk, exhausted by endless wars, embraced it. The lords, wary of losing more wealth and power, found it tolerable. In time, many even found it preferable, discovering that cooperation yielded profits and stability beyond what they'd known. Davos Seaworth, the Onion Knight, walked the corridors of the Red Keep, remembering the ghosts of the past. He sometimes stopped by a window to watch the city below, where the streets were cleaner, the markets livelier. He'd think of all who had died: Stannis, Shireen, Jon Snow's allies, Daenerys' armies, Tyrion Lannister's schemes, and wondered if their spirits could see what had been wrought here. Maybe it wasn't the fairy tale peace Shireen might have dreamed of, but it was real, and it saved lives. One brisk evening, he stood on the same balcony overlooking King's Landing, the air carrying a faint tang of wood smoke. Alice approached, as she often did, and stood beside him. She wore a simple tunic, having just finished drill practice with the City Watch. "You've done it," she said softly. You've given the 7 kingdoms something like peace. Davos inclined his head. For now, he said with a cautious smile. Peace is never permanent. It must be nurtured, guarded. But yes, for now, we've given them a chance. She turned to him. Is this what you envisioned back when you first joined the assembly? He chuckled. I never envisioned any of this. I only knew we had to try something different. She reached out and squeezed his shoulder lightly. Maybe that's why you succeeded. You didn't chase power or glory. You simply did what was right. They looked out over the city, at the torchlit windows and winding streets, and for a moment, neither spoke. There was a hush, a sense of possibility. In that hush, Davos allowed himself a rare emotion. Contentment. Not for himself, but for the realm. Maybe this would be remembered as a fleeting golden age, or maybe it would fade into chaos eventually. But in that moment, Westeros was more united than it had been in living memory. The ravages of war had taught them a lesson, and Davos Seaworth had become the steward of its memory, the keeper of its fragile hope. His pragmatic morality, honed through loss and duty, shaped the realm's recovery. He did not wear a crown, nor did he want one. Yet the people acknowledged him as the man who guided them toward a common good. Far below, in the winding alleyways, he could imagine the voices of children laughing, merchants haggling, travelers sharing tales of roads made safe. In that tapestry of ordinary life lay the quiet triumph of a realm that had once bled itself dry for the ambitions of kings. Now, at least for a season, it sought healing under the watchful gaze of an onion knight who had never expected to shape history, but who had done so by staying true to the simple values of honesty, loyalty, and compassion. And so, without fanfare, Davos Seaworth guided the 7 kingdoms toward a tenuous but precious peace. Perhaps it would last a generation, or perhaps a new threat would someday test its mettle. But it stood now, an unlikely testament to the notion that one man's steadfast conscience could accomplish what armies and dragons had not. A realm where unity was not imposed by fire and blood, but formed by mutual need and guarded by simple decency. As the night's breeze ruffled Davos's graying hair, he closed his eyes and breathed in the scent of the city, letting the moment soak into his very bones. He felt the circlet on his brow, a quiet symbol of responsibility. Stannis had once cut off 4 of his fingers to teach him the price of smuggling, yet had knighted him for feeding a starving castle. Now, in an odd turn of fate, Davos taught the lords of Westeros the price of division, and knighted them, in spirit, for embracing cooperation. In the darkness, a faint smile touched his lips. He remembered the onion patch he had once brought to a desperate fortress, the hushed gratitude of men who had been saved by a simple act of mercy. Perhaps that was all it ever took to change the world. A humble offering, delivered to those in need, without expectation of reward. And here, decades later, that same principle had helped him nurture an entire realm back from the brink. In the hush of the King's Landing night, Davos Seaworth, Lord Counselor and Onion Knight, opened his eyes and gazed upon the city he had once known as a dangerous maze of power. Now it was his charge to safeguard it and the realm beyond. If the gods were kind, he would do so until his last breath, leaving behind a legacy not of conquest but of unity, a testament to the quiet strength of simple, steadfast virtue. And if Westeros remembered him for that, even for a little while, it would be enough.